Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Dr. Matt Harris has discovered that Bruce R. McConkie wrote Official Declaration 2, announcing the revelation that Spencer W. Kimball had received, in which black men could be ordained to the priesthood and both men and women could enter the LDS temples and be sealed to their families. It was quite a monumental revelation. The amazing thing is Bruce R. McConkie had written several unflattering things in his book, Mormon Doctrine, about blacks and the Negro race. So this is going to be a very fun conversation. We're also going to talk about a conversation that President Kimball had with a member of the Carter administration. It's really going to be interesting. Apparently the Carter administration didn't like the ban and was trying to put a little bit of pressure on the church. It's going to be a very fun conversation. Before we get there, I just want to mention one other thing. Next week is the Mormon History Association meetings in Boise, Idaho, June 7th through the 9th. I will be there. I'm really excited. It's one of my favorite things to do. I know many of you can't make it to there, but one of the things that I'd like to do is I'd like to go into phase 2 and create some special Mormon history classes that are most interesting to you. So what I'd like to do is if you could please sign up at tinyurl.com/Y8PDZJ88. I'd like to set up a 20 to 30 minute phone call with you. The first 7 people to sign up will get a free transcript of any transcript that we've produced here on Gospel Tangents. So I just need a Gmail address. We'll do this through Google Hangouts. And I'd really like to find out what's most interesting to you. Is it black history? Is it polygamy? Is it the Mark Hoffman bombings? Anything, especially that we've already talked about, or maybe we haven't talked about it here at Gospel Tangents. So I'd like to make this a very useful class to all of you, and I'd like it to be what you like most. So please, once again, sign up at tinyurl.com/Y8PDZJ88. And I'd love to have a face-to-face conversation with you. Of course, it can be anywhere in the world. Google Hangouts is everywhere. So as long as you have a Gmail address, just sign up with that. I've got my calendar. I'd like to get this done in the next 7 days if possible. So thanks again. And now back to our conversation.
The other thing is he announces this incredible vision for the church that we need to universalize the Mormon message, the gospel message. That means every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. There's no footnote that says except black nations, African nations. It means every, right? Mm-hmm. Every member a missionary. And keep in mind that the church had tried an experiment the previous decade in the 60s to put missionaries in Nigeria. It fails miserably because Nigerians are upset that they have to have white leadership from Utah, this American nation, to run our churches. Why can't we run our own? Well, they don't have the priesthood. And so it's an experiment. I think the Brethren tried opening up a mission in Nigeria just to see if it would work, and it didn't work. A lot of issues that I'm going to write about.
This is what Prince talks about.
Prince talks about it a little bit. Yep.
1962.
Yep. And a guy named Lamar Williams is the guy from Utah who's over there to shepherd this work. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so I'll write about that too. There's some interesting details in Nigeria. So, but with President Kimball, so he's got the Brazil Temple, he's got this great vision of universalizing the gospel message. He's going to send a Mars Candy executive named Merrill Bateman, who will later become a general authority and president of BYU. But Bateman had spent some time in Africa, and in the 1970s he calls Merrill Bateman in, and he tells Bateman that essentially I'm going to send you to Africa. And just let me know about the people there who were sympathetic towards the church. And they had some branches there at the time. And let me know about the strength. And Bateman has no idea what's going on. I mean, he tells Bateman, don't tell anybody about this. Nobody. This is just between you and me, not even my counselors. And yeah. And so Bateman comes back and gives President Kimball a report. By this time, his counselors were invited to the meeting, so clearly President Kimball had shared it with President Romney and Tanner. And so Bateman he said, yeah, we've got a couple of guys there that went to BYU. There's a handful of Africans who went to BYU back in the 60s over Ernest Wilkinson's protest. Another whole story. Mm-hmm. And he said, they're faithful, they're smart, they're intelligent, they could run the church. And thank you, Brother Bateman. And so anyway, I haven't talked to Merrill Bateman. I can't imagine he didn't know what was going on, but who knows? Maybe he didn't. Anyway, so President Kimball's doing some reconnaissance work in Africa. If we lift this ban, we got to know that these people can run the church. So he gets this very heartening report from Merrill Bateman, and who was a member of the Candy Mars Corporation. So he had spent some time there working for Mars, doing business, and that's why he was asked to go.
Oh.
Also going on behind the scenes is President Kimball's meeting with a man named Jack Carlson, who he's a PhD in economics from Harvard. He's a liberal Mormon Democrat. He's one of the Proud Three. And in the 70s. Yeah. And anyway, so he works in the Carter administration. And he calls Jack Carlson into his office and just has this very candid discussion. This is, I think, I want to say 76, 77, somewhere in there. Calls in Jack Carlson, and his wife, too, is there. It's just the three of them, President Kimball and the Carlsons. And he says, Jack, why do the Carter people hate us so much? He said, President, don't you get it? He said, no, tell me. That's why you're here. He said, they hate our views on ERA, our views towards women in ERA. And this is in the midst of the ERA movement. And of course, Utah was a holdup, arguably one of the states that kills the amendment, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And the church was against it, and that galvanized support, or opposition, I should say. And the other thing is, they don't like our views towards black people. And President Kimball, without missing a beat, he says, we've got to change this policy. But I can't. I'm worried. I'm worried about how the saints in the South will take this policy. Same thing McKay had to deal with, remember? Mm-hmm. And I'm worried about my brethren in the 12. So he says.
What year is this again?
This is 75, 76.
Okay.
Yeah. He's just telling this, there's nothing prayerful about this. No, well, God, I'm going to have a revelation. I'm going to have to pray to the Lord to see what he says. I mean, he was just speaking very pragmatically. Mm-hmm. That we need to lift this ban. I've got this vision for the church, and I can't fulfill this vision as long as we can't get into African nations. But I've got a problem. I've got members of the 12 who don't support it, and I've got members in the South. Who knows what's going to happen if, you know. So anyway, he's saying little bits and pieces going on here and there. And here's where the story, I think, really gets, just increases my admiration for President Kimball. He will meet with the apostles one by one and in group meetings. This is a great exercise in interpersonal leadership, organizational leadership, as they say. And so President Kimball will meet both collectively and individually with each of the apostles. And he'll ask them to produce written accounts of their views about the ban. And Elder McConkie, of course, writes an account too. You can imagine. He's got some feelings about it.
He just pulled chapter whatever out of Mormon Doctrine, right?
Right. Go see chapter so. I've already covered that. Go read the book. Buy the book. And but anyway, it's kind of a funny story, you know. But Elder McConkie, yeah, I can see that we have a problem with the Brazil Temple. I've got a solution. We should lift the ban.
That's what McConkie said? Really?
Yeah. And it's a great story because, of course, President Kimball has understood this much earlier, but needed to get Elder McConkie's buy-in.
Wow.
So Elder McConkie, I've got the solution. We need to lift this ban to help our Brazilian brothers and sisters out. And I'll just pause for a moment. Joseph Fielding McConkie, his son who taught at BYU for years, died in, I think, 2013 of cancer. But anyway, he wrote a memoir or a biography of his father that Desert Book published in 2003. And on the chapter on the priesthood revelation, Joseph Fielding McConkie gives credit to the revelation, as I read it, to his father.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I chuckle with this because President Kimball knows what he's doing. Mm-hmm. And he needs to get Elder McConkie's buy-in. And when he gets Elder McConkie's buy-in that the revelation needs to go, or that the ban needs to be lifted, I mean, he feels like there's a tremendous weight off his shoulders. And this isn't to take away, of course, you know, any of the spiritual aspects of the temple and the revelation and the things that the The apostles will recount afterwards about it being the most magnificent spiritual experience of their life. I think that's all very authentic and genuine. But it just speaks to President Kimball's remarkable leadership, that in order to do this, I've got to really work with my associates and massage them and help them to understand this is the right thing to do. And to me, that's just an incredible, remarkable exercise in leadership on President Kimball's part. Mm-hmm. Because he doesn't want to create a schism in the 12 like President Woodruff had under his leadership. And I'm sure as the church president that President Kimball could have just done something unilaterally. But if there's no buy-in, what's the point? Right? If people don't feel that this is the right thing to do. And so that's really one of the most remarkable things is that he gets the buy-in from Elder McConkie. And what's equally remarkable is not only is there buy-in from Elder McConkie, the biggest doctrinal hardliner, but it's Elder McConkie who writes the second official manifesto that will be added to the Doctrine and Covenants. That's his language.
Oh, that's McConkie.
They asked
really?
3 people, as I recall, to write letters when the revelation happened. Elder McConkie, Elder Monson, Thomas S. Monson, and Boyd K. Packer. And so each of those men had submitted their drafts to the First Presidency, and they chose Elder McConkie's.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on, but that's the upshot. And the last thing is President Kimball, I mean, the genealogy department just got deluged with requests from the mission field. You know, we've got this brother who's got black blood, what do we do? And there was a growing sense, at least among some general authorities, you know, we can't lecture President Kimball and tell him what to do, but the church work was so difficult with these kinds of things. And I'll just tell you one quick story. There was a woman in Mexico, a sister missionary, and she'd been out, I think, for 15 months, and 18-month mission, so she's on her tail end. And anyway, she discovered that she had African ancestry, when she's almost done. And so her mission president writes a guy named Tom Fyans, who is the general authority at 70 over that mission. Dear President Fyans, what do I do? And Fyans, he writes back to the mission president, what kind of a missionary is she? Oh, she's most faithful, and she's an effective missionary and bears a strong testimony. How much time does she have left? About 16 months. And Fyans writes back, I think you should take about 4 or 5 months and study the issue. I mean, this is going on a lot in the church. Wow. And it's going on in branches when you've got branch presidents who have Negroid blood, and they're great branch presidents, and they have the affection of their ward or their branch, and all of a sudden, oh, I've got African ancestry. So they see this a lot. And it weighs on President Kimball, and it weighs on other authorities. And so it creates the First Presidency Secretary will say this after the revelation. He goes on record and he'll say that it creates, the priesthood revelation lifted a collective sense of guilt the brethren had felt over the years. I think I got that quote exactly right. Okay. It lifted a collective sense of guilt the brethren felt over the years.
Wow.
Yeah. So this was Francis Gibbons, who wrote lots of biographies about church presidents. Mm-hmm. So he was the church president during the revelation, or the First Presidency's, President Kimball's secretary.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's what he said. It lifted a collective sense of guilt the brethren had felt over the years.
Wow. Well, it must have been. I mean, because I've heard other stories about people. In fact, I'm trying to remember if that was one of your presentations last year about somebody, and I want to say it was from either BYU or the Church History Library or something, that had said something about somebody in, I want to say, Panama, that he went to the bishop and said, I want to be ordained, or the branch president. And they said, well, you're black, you can't. And he went to his mom and she said, you're not black. And so he told the branch president, you're not black. And he goes, oh, okay, well, we'll ordain you. Was that your presentation?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Or not your presentation, but it was in that same session?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a very interesting story. So there were lots of exceptions to the rule over the years, I guess.
Yeah, it's ad hoc, really. You've got, without going into details, you get some instances in church leadership where a bishop confesses, I just learned that I have black ancestry, and the presiding authority says, okay, carry on, brother. What? Yeah, you heard me, the Lord needs you. okay. And then you get other instances where, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, so you must stay your hand. And that was a nice idiom that meant that we're going to have to release you from your bishop calling, your calling as bishop. You can't exercise your priesthood publicly, you must stay your hand, but you can exercise it privately in your own home.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then there's a couple of instances that I know of where they release the bishop, the ward's upset, they love this bishop, and after about a year and a half, when there's nobody to really fill in the gaps, okay, we lifted it. It was like 1968, you can be the bishop again. You don't have to stay your hand anymore. And yeah, so, you know, I'm not trying to make light of this important thing, but once again, it speaks to the pragmatic effects of this policy. They need good priesthood holders in these units in South America. And we haven't even talked about other places like, you know, Australian Aborigines and Fiji and some of the Pacific Islands.
Well, and from what I understand, they were not considered African and therefore not descendants of Cain and therefore could be ordained, especially Fiji and Australia.
That's correct. But they had this is the 1950s when President McKay, they did a lot of research into this. So in Fiji, when they started to open up a mission, we had talked about after World War II expanding. Well, part of that expansion meant the Pacific Islands. And it took them a long time to develop missions in the Pacific Islands, even well into the 1970s and even 80s. Anyway, but they get into Fiji, I think in the 50s, and of course the question is, these are dark-skinned Fijians, and can they hold the priesthood? Are they from Africa, their ancestry? And so they don't know. And the first presidency, they're getting letters from, as you can imagine, they get letters from the mission field. What do we do? The missionaries are wondering, should we baptize them? Should we confirm them to the priesthood? And they turn to the church scriptorian, Joseph Fielding Smith. Brother Smith, do they have African ancestry? And he writes this lengthy letter back. This is 1954 to the first presidency, and he says, I've done a lot of research. I've looked at the Encyclopedia Britannica. I've looked here, I've looked there. I can't tell you. I'm at a loss. And so what happens is that some local leaders will go to I think it's called the Fijian Institute Museum or something. It's some local museum in Fiji, and they meet with some anthropologists, these LDS leaders in Fiji. And they ask these anthropologists, are Fijians descendants of Africans? And they say unequivocally no. And they use that evidence, they share that evidence with President McKay. And once he sees the evidence, especially since President Smith can't determine it, then he says, okay, green light, let's ordain these folks.
Wow.
This is like 1958. So what's interesting about this whole ban is, of course, it's based on, I think this is important for your listening audience to know, it's based on bloodline, not skin color. And so it's possible to have a blue-eyed, blonde-haired person with African ancestry, so blue-eyed, blonde-haired, fair-skinned with African ancestry, and they can't hold the priesthood because of their lineage, right? And then you can have this very dark-skinned Fijian who can hold the priesthood. And it really creates, I'm going to create a word here today, but a racial no man's land, if you will. Because I can think of one story where this LDS man who fell into that category, he was white, fair-skinned, Caucasian, and he had African ancestry, supposedly. And he goes into Joseph Fielding Smith, and he said, I'm torn, I'm crushed, I want to serve a mission. What should I do? I want to marry a woman in the temple. And President Smith looks at him and he says, I don't have anything for you, I don't know what to tell you. This man was agonizing because he just said, I'm not a Negro. Look at me, I'm not a Negro. And I don't feel comfortable marrying a Negro. But yet, I can't marry a Caucasian woman because I want to marry in the temple. And I can't take her to the temple. And President Smith just basically, I don't know what to tell you. And anyway, it's controversial.
The thing that I want to ask about that, because we talked a little bit about the one drop or the 1/4 rule, was, I mean, if this person looks white, I wouldn't think that a grandparent would have been black, so it would have been farther back than that.
Probably, yeah.
So, I mean, if we're following the old slavery rule about 1/4,
Yeah.
It looks like it did go more to a one-drop rule.
Yeah.
As time went on with the priesthood ban.
Yeah, I don't remember. In this case, in this particular case, I don't know where his ancestry went. If it was further back, or I just remember from the interview that I can't hold the priesthood. I'm agonizing over this. I want to hold the priesthood, and I can't.
Well, I mean, would it make sense that it was farther back than grandparents, though, for this ancestry?
Yeah, oftentimes the restrictions went further back than grandparents. Yeah, so what would that be? So you're the math guy. So 1/25th would be grandparents, 1/16th, 1/8, the further we go back.
Well, yeah, so
right?
1/4 would be grandparents.
1/4, yeah.
One
quarter would be grandparents.
Great parent, and
right.
1/16th would be
1/16th would be great. And these racial laws that were created in the early 20th century, they fluctuated between 1/16th, 1/8, and 1/4.
That's what the U.S. law did.
Yeah. The church, though, what's interesting about this in the 20th century, that the church followed the 1/4 rule, the quarter rule, I guess as they called it, but they also called it the 1-drop rule.
Right.
That if you have 1 drop, now there's no fraction involved with 1 drop, right? But if you've got 1 drop, you're disqualified.
So you could go by 8 generations all of a sudden and be like, oh,
yeah.
I'm now disqualified.
Yeah. And that's why one of the reasons, not to go off topic, but one of the reasons Hugh Nibley had a problem with the ban is you go back far enough, everybody has Negroid blood, he wrote.
Right.
And so, but that was the 1-drop rule, is that, you'd be penalized for grandparents and, that sort of thing. And so this guy, I mean, I guess we can deduce that clearly it wouldn't have been, a grandparent that was of African origin, went further back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it creates a hardship when you've got dark-skinned people who can hold the priesthood and light-skinned people, who look Caucasian, and they look white, but yet they're banned from the priesthood in the temple.
Yeah, that's strange.
It's a tough one, yeah.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. We're not done with Matt just yet, but we're going to take a break for now. We're done talking about the temple and priesthood ban with Matt, but one of the other things I'd like to do is I'd like to re-release, or for the first time release on YouTube, our interview with Dr. Paul Reeve of the University of Utah. Unfortunately, my camera cut out last year, and I've decided to add some still photographs of our conversation. I've also cleaned up the audio. In our next conversation with Dr. Paul Reeve, we're going to talk about Orson Pratt's very surprising vote in the 1852 legislature. Listen to this.
Pratt votes against both of those bills, and the minutes tell us that he does so because they don't allow black men to vote.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter @gospeltangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.